Welcome to the next e-CENS video to reveal why switching from Universal Analytics to Google Analytics 4 requires time and resources. Hi, I'm Holger Tempel, partner at e-CENS and managing director of e-CENS in Germany. The last video's topic was about the differences between interaction hits and event hits. Also, I've already talked about users in one of the previous videos. Today, I will talk about sessions, how they are identified in Google Analytics, and why sessions in GA4 significantly differ from Universal Analytics. To understand the differences between both Universal Analytics and GA4, this episode is going to be quite a bit technical. That being said, try to follow along. When you start evaluating your numbers, you will always come across the metric sessions. This particular metric is available in Universal Analytics as well as in GA4. And if you are analyzing your website with both, you will find out that GA4 most likely shows a lower number of sessions than Universal Analytics does. But why is that? First of all, you need to know what a session is. Basically, a session is a number of consecutive interactions that a user conducts when visiting your website. So in this scenario, a user opens the website of an online shop by using his PC and typing the URL into his browser. By doing so, he, respectively the browser instance, will be assigned a client ID. If you want to know more about client ID, I'd recommend watching the video about users from this video series. Since the website in this scenario is tracked with both, there's a tracking ID for Universal Analytics and a measurement ID for GA4. So let's say the user has opened the website's homepage on July 1st and then exhibits the following behavior. He visits a page, then clicks on another page, scrolls down that page, then opens another page, also scrolls down that page, clicks on another page, and finally buys a product. Now let's see how this behavior is being processed in Universal Analytics. And this is done by involving the Google Analytics server, also known as Google Analytics endpoint, which will serve as a hit collector. And this is because the server will store each and every hit in a log file. But what data will be sent to this hit collector? Since we are talking about Universal Analytics, the data being sent to the server is called interaction hit and always consists of at least a client ID, tracking ID, and date, which will then be combined with the time and the type of interaction, in this case a page view. Then the data will be sent to the hit collector and stored in the log file. And as a side note, what you see here is only a small portion of the data being sent to Universal Analytics. If you want to know more about the payload of a hit, I'd recommend watching part 7 of this video series. The next interaction, which is also a page view, will then be sent and stored too, of course. Then scrolling down the page will be sent as an interaction of the hit type event and will be stored accordingly. The same happens to all other page views and events. Only the last interaction is a bit different. When the user has purchased the product, this will be sent and stored as a transaction. Obviously, the first entry here is the start of the session, while the last entry marks the end of the session. But how does Universal Analytics know when a session starts or ends? Let's start with a question about when a session ends in Universal Analytics, and this is quite easy to answer. As you already might know, a session ends after an idle time of 30 minutes. This means that there are no more entries in the log file within 30 minutes after the last entry. So Universal Analytics will look at the time for each line in the log. And if the difference between two consecutive entries is more than 30 minutes, the first of both will mark the end of the current session and the second will mark the start of a new session. And when you go through the log here and compare consecutive entries with each other, you will find out that entry 1 and 2 have a time difference of 21 seconds, the next pair is 2 seconds, followed by 19 seconds, followed by 8 seconds, followed by 23 seconds, and finally the entry 6 and 7 also have a time difference of 23 seconds. And since entry 7 is the last entry in the log file with no consecutive entries within 30 minutes, it will mark the end of the session. The Google Analytics server now needs to find out which of the log entries marks the start of a session, and therefore, in theory, all log entries need to be considered to see which of the entries is the first. And since this is almost impossible, Universal Analytics will only examine those entries which are from the same date. This leads to the conclusion that a session automatically ends when the date changes, and therefore a new session will then be started. When you look at the entries here, you will see that they are all from the same date, which also implies that they all belong to the same session. Now let's check if there is another condition that causes the start of a new session. And each time a session starts in Universal Analytics, the corresponding dimensions, source and medium will also be assigned to the session, and both are valid for the duration of the session. Conversely, this means that as soon as the source or medium changes, a new session is started. In this scenario, the source is direct and the medium is none, since the user has opened the website directly by entering the URL in the browser. In addition, neither source nor medium has changed, which also implies that the entries belong to the same session. So now it's time for the Google Analytics server to process the log file and aggregate the data so it can be stored in the corresponding database. And this aggregated data will show one user with one session consisting of 7 interactions. Now let's sum up how sessions are processed in Universal Analytics. A session will start with any kind of interaction hit. Most likely this will be a page view, and only under some very rare conditions it will be another interaction hit. A session in Universal Analytics will always be calculated server-side, which means that the Google Analytics servers will have to process the entries in the log files of the hit collector and then stitch each user's session together. That being said, this approach is also quite cost-intense, speaking in terms of CPU power and memory. Also, a session will end after an idle time of 30 minutes, which means that there have not been sent interaction hits to Google Analytics for at least 1800 seconds. And last but not least, a new session will always be started when the user returns to the website after the idle time of 30 minutes, or when the date, the source, or the medium changes. Now let's see how GA4 is taking care of sessions. So coming back to the scenario, how is this user's behavior going to be processed in GA4? Well, also here, client ID, measurement ID, and date will be sent together with time and hit to the Google Analytics hit collector. Also here, the data sent will be stored in the log file. But when you look at the line a little bit more in detail, you will find out that there are more information available than just client ID, measurement ID, timestamp, and event name. You will find information like SID, which stands for Session ID and reflects the exact date and time when the session began. This is stored in Unix time format, which means this is the number of seconds since 1970. And this information will also be available for each subsequent event hit. You will also find the key value pair SCT, which stands for Session Count. This indicates the number of sessions this particular user or browser instance has had on this website. Next is the parameter SEG, which stands for Session Engaged. This Boolean value tells if the session is considered as engaged or not. Engaged is reflected with a value of 1 and not engaged by 0, like in this case. Basically, GA4 considers a session to be engaged if it lasts for 10 seconds or longer, or has 2 or more page or screen views, or has 1 or more conversion events. And then there are 2 additional parameters which are also of a Boolean type and will only be used once per session or per browser instance, also known as user. The first one is _SS and indicates the session start. This parameter tells GA4 when a particular session starts, so this has not to be calculated on server side, it will be done client side. And the second one is _FV and indicates the first visit of a browser instance, also known as user. This will tell GA4 when a user has arrived on the website for the very first time. Both parameters therefore enable GA4 to do the comparison about new and returning users much easier. Now, coming back to the scenario, of course the consecutive interaction will also be sent and stored in the log file. And as you might have already recognized, there's no _SS and no _FV, but now the SEG parameter is set to 1. This is because the session at that time already lasts longer than 10 seconds and has had 2 page views. Then, also every consecutive interaction will be sent and stored in the log file. Please keep in mind that the parameters displayed here are only a subset of the data being sent to GA4. If you want to know more about event hits and their payload, I encourage you to watch part 7 of this video series. So what you now know is that since the parameter _FV is set to 1, this is also the first time the user visits the website. In addition, the parameter _SS is set to 1, which marks this line to be the start of the session. One big advantage of GA4 is now that unlike in Universal Analytics, neither a change of date nor a change of source or medium will start a new session. And since the line with the purchase event hit is the last line containing the client ID in conjunction with this particular session ID, it marks the end of the session. That being said, the Google Analytics server now simply has to aggregate the data from the log file and then store it accordingly. And the outcome then is 1 user, 1 session, and 15 events. You might now think, hold a second, 15 events? Where do 15 events come from? And you're absolutely right to ask this question. I'll have to show you a use case which is a bit simpler to answer this question. And the use case looks like this. The user visits our website on August 31st and lands on the homepage at almost 5 p.m. A couple of seconds later, he logs into the website and the homepage reloads with a different content. Let's assume that this particular user has not browsed the website with his PC before. So when he opens the site in his browser, the tracking code will assign a new client ID. So now let's check what happens when the user opens the homepage. In the payload of the development tools, you will find information about client ID, session count, session engaged, first visit, and session start. So the insight that you can get from this data is that this is the first session due to session count being set to 1, as well as first visit being set to 1. Next is that the session started with this event hit because _SS is also set to 1. And finally, you see that the session is not engaged since SEG is set to 0. Now looking at the second event hits payload in the development tools, you will find out that only information about client ID, session count, and session engaged are available, while session start and first visit have gone. And this is absolutely correct, since this is a consecutive event hit which will neither indicate the start of a session nor the first visit. Another obvious change is that this session now is considered as to be engaged since the parameter SEG is now set to 1. So let's find out how GA4 will handle these two event hits, and in the debug view of GA4 you will see that it will rather split the first event hit into 3 events. So when you click on the event first visit, which comes from the FV parameter, you will find information about the session ID under GA_session_ID, which comes from the parameter SID. And you will also find information about the session count under GA_session_number, which comes from the parameter SCT. So in conclusion, when a user visits the website for the very first time, the _FV parameter in the event hits payload will be extracted to its own event in GA4. Now let's examine the page view event by clicking on it. And also the event page view will provide the identical information about session ID and session count. And also the event session start, which comes from the parameter _SS, will provide the same information about session ID and session count. Now, when the consecutive event hit is sent to GA4, besides the information about session, also information about the user engagement is sent to GA4. And the event user_engagement is calculated client-side and reflects the number of milliseconds between the current event and the previous event. So in this case, the time between the two events is almost 44 seconds. And then after the event user engagement, the pageview event from the second event hit will follow, also carrying information about the session ID and the session count. So now you will come to the conclusion that the first event hit from the user session will be divided into 3 events in GA4, and the second event hit will result in 2 events in GA4. And these 2 consecutive event hits lead to 1 user, 1 session, and 5 events in Google Analytics. So now you know why the number of events in the previous scenario is more than twice as high compared to the number of interactions. Okay, now let's sum up how sessions are processed in GA4. A session will start with the event session start. Most likely this will occur in conjunction with a pageview, and only under some very rare conditions it will be another interaction hit. A session in GA4 will always be calculated client-side, and therefore the Google Analytics service will be provided with detailed information about the session ID to identify the session in conjunction with the client ID, the session count to provide information about the session number. Also, information is provided if the session is considered engaged or not, when the session started, and if the session has been the first visit of the browser instance. Like in Universal Analytics, a session will also end in GA4 after 30 minutes of inactivity. And last but not least, a new session will always be started when the user returns to the website after the idle time of 30 minutes. Like always, I hope this video was helpful, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one. And always keep in mind, experience cannot be learned, it must be gathered. Therefore, rely on the expert's experience only.